Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy. And we also have joining us a special guest, Joe Grossheim, who's a PhD student at the University of St. Thomas down in Houston in the great state of Texas. And today, our topic is going to be looking at some of the kind of the foundational work for much of our Catholic faith and much of what we talk about here on the podcast with Thomistic philosophy, and that's going to be Aristotle. But before we get into today's topic, I want to invite everybody, please like and share this video. Help us out. That's a good way for us to help grow our community throughout all the socials. So please help us out in that way. Give a thumbs up, give a like, and subscribe. So today, our topic, we're going to be looking at Aristotle's Physics books, book 2. We're going to be looking at chapters 8 and 9. And the main question, I know this already sounds heady, but the main questions we want to look at is, does nature act for an end? And what exactly do we mean by nature? And this is important for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, when we're talking about just the study of nature, right? Science, it has to be intelligible in order for us to put together science books, right? Mm-hmm. There has to be some sort of order to it. And so we recognize in some way on a secular level that there's an ordered creation, right? Creation has purpose and was created for a purpose. And especially for us as Christians, right? Man being part of that nature has a purpose as well. And so what we're going to talk about today really serves not only an understanding a good anthropology, but also it serves as a foundation for ethics and morals. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Smith, let's kick us off here. And how do we even wrap our heads around and kind of dive into these first questions of nature acting to an end? Maybe explain the question if you want.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I love that phrase, nature acts for an end. There's certain sort of propositions, maxims, theses that you run across in your study of philosophy that you write, like they're arresting, right? They get your attention and they really are formative. You can't just build philosophy on a couple of sayings, but nevertheless, they really are good, like reference points and foundational. I think about like the opening of the Metaphysics where Aristotle says, all men by nature desire to know, or the Socratic maxim, the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, those are great propositions. You just don't they excite the mind and lead you to think. And another one of these is that nature acts for an end. I will sometimes in just the middle of a discussion just throw that down with somebody, and it changes the nature of the conversation, right? Oh, wait, like maybe nature does that. What does that mean? That sort of thing. So I think it's a powerful thesis and one that's had a lot of influence, I think, in the history of philosophy and culture. So there's two questions then we really have to think about then, right? Is like, well, what is nature, right? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean for it to act for an end? And I think that first question maybe is a little more challenging than we might anticipate, right? We use maybe the word nature or maybe the adjective natural, right? Or the phrase the natural world, in sort of a, kind of a broad way. But Aristotle really means by nature something that's very specific, right? By nature, he means something. It means an internal principle of rest and motion, or an intrinsic principle of change, right? Internal principle, right? So principle here means source or origin, right? So we're not thinking about an ethical principle or epistemological principle, but we just think something like an arche, a source or an origin, right? Within the substance of change, and I would add maybe development, right, would be a good mm-hmm. way, to think about it. We tend to sometimes think about change kind of abstractly, right? Change for Aristotle always happens in substances and between substances, right? So it's not sort of an abstraction, but something happening to a subject, right? Or something that a subject is doing. So in that sense, right, a tree growing in your yard is an example of nature, mm-hmm. right? That is, as long as it's within the appropriate environment, the seed that's planted in the soil will germinate and that nature will develop. It will develop from its internal principle, its internal structure, right? It will develop in a broadly predictable way into a flourish, into a sapling, and then eventually into a mature tree. That is an example of nature. Or, another example is if you've ever had, I think in the South we call it cane, but you could also call it bamboo, right? It goes where it wants to go, right? Even if you don't want it to shoot across your yard, right? It will actually go underground, 100 yards or 50 yards, and then pop up in the middle of your yard, right? It's acting for an end, right? Or put it this way, it is acting according to an intrinsic principle of motion, not what I want it to do. Right now, when I come along and cut it down, that's a different matter, right? That's not nature, but that's what Aristotle means by nature. You could distinguish that from art, right? So art would be like the microphone in front of my face, the glasses that I'm wearing, the earphones that we're all wearing, the books over, on my shelf. Those are all instances where we have used human knowledge, human knowledge and craft to take natural things and change them according to our purposes, right? So we, you hear the phrase occasionally repurpose, right? We have, in a certain sense, repurposed them, right? It's sort of like with tomato plants, right? Tomatoes don't exist naturally for the sake of being placed on a BLT sandwich, right? But that's a darn good use of a tomato by us, right? That's the purpose that we give, right, to the tomato. So that would be an example of art. Does that make sense, Joe?
Yeah. The only thing I think I would add to help us recognize what nature is that nature is what is always and for the most part. Right. That's another principle that comes up in Aristotle, and maybe it's not as arresting as nature acts for an end, but it's at least as important, right? So when you look outside and you see, a tree fall in a certain way and kill an animal or something, that you might think, oh, that's natural, right? But it's not always, for the most part, for trees to fall and kill animals. So we wouldn't say like it belongs to the end for which a tree is acting to fall and kill animals just because it happens occasionally, right?
That's right.
So we want to recognize in natural substances what it is that they do always and for the most part, and that would be what we were going to attribute to them as natural. Yeah,
that's a great point. Because it's not this comes up sometimes with with students when they ask about whether or not death is natural, right? And you kind of want to say, well, in one sense yes, but in another sense no, right?
Yeah, death is a hard one,
right? Because you want to say like, yeah, this is what happens, but is it according? It's really the decline of the intrinsic principle of the thing, right? The corruption of its intrinsic principle that brings about the end of a living organism, right? So it is kind of natural in a way, but not in maybe a different way. It's certainly not the natural end, right?
Right.
For which the species exists. But yeah, that's a good, always and for the most part. And like, so if you want to say like, some trees are taken up in art and turned through practice into paper, right? Like they're turned into pulp and then into paper. But that's not natural for a tree as tree, right? Because unimpeded trees don't become books or pieces of paper.
Right.
And I would add right now, if you go to Lowe's, right, you can find a real tree and an artificial tree, right?
That's right.
And so I mean, I think that's a good way to maybe think about the two distinctions we're trying to make here between nature and art, right? So think of the word artificial, right? So it's that kind of modeling after nature, but when you use the word artificial, it's something that does not occur in nature, right?
That's
I don't get this plastic green tree that has embedded lights into it. Right. I don't find that in nature. It's artificial. So that's a good way, I think, to maybe draw those distinctions.
Sure. And I think another way of distinguishing art and nature is to think about which is more fundamental, right? And Aristotle very clearly thinks that that art is kind of, I mean, obviously art's very important, right? It's a great thing that we humans can do, right? In terms of, using our knowledge and craft to bring about things for our purposes, but it's secondary, right? It presupposes nature, right? There's a reason that we don't build chairs, right? Out of, there's several reasons that we don't build chairs out of inappropriate materials like leaves or something like that, right? Because they wouldn't work very well, because the underlying nature isn't such that it would serve that purpose well. There's a way in which our art is constricted by nature, right? It sort of presupposes nature. You wouldn't, there's a lot of things that might develop in one area where there are certain kinds of natural organisms that wouldn't develop in another area. In terms of like even just things like how you provide food, what kinds of clothes you make, all that sort of thing. So I think that's do you have any other examples you think about, Joe, that are like that?
I was thinking about how we use stones in buildings, and I was thinking maybe we see the mountain, and the mountain is like the foundation for a whole ecosystem or a whole thing. It's able to hold up whatever is on top of it, right? And recognizing the stone has this sort of natural capacity that can be repurposed to hold up other structures like a home or something. So whenever we're using art, we're recognizing some natural capacity that a thing has that can then be repurposed for some other end that is not a natural end to that substance, right? But some other end that serves us.
Right. And what that shows us, right, is that nature has a certain primacy over art, or that it's prior, right?
Yeah. Or that art imitates nature, right? That we recognize in nature certain functions that certain substances perform that can be taken up into art, right? In a different way.
Yeah. So I think this helps us to move also past maybe a kind of colloquial use of the word nature and natural that sometimes comes about just in maybe culturally or casual conversations, where we just sort of like use natural in a very broad sense to say what's not human, right? Or what's out there in the woods, right? That's going to be important because things happen in the woods that are by chance, right? But aren't, in Aristotle's sense, and I think this helps, aren't according to nature. Right. So we can maybe explain this more as we go along, but this will kind of start pushing us towards an Aristotelian notion of nature and nature acting for an end. If a lightning, kind of using what an example similar to Joe's falling tree, if a lightning bolt kills a badger in the woods, right, that isn't according to nature. That's a chance event. Now, we might tend to say, well, in the natural world, sometimes that happens, right? And, in a loose sense of natural, maybe, okay, fine, if you just mean what happens, between natural organisms sometimes, right? But that's not very instructive, right, or illuminating use. And certainly Aristotle means something more specific, right, than just what happens to natural organisms now and then, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah. So take the lightning bolt, right? And we can recognize in the bolt of lightning that its nature is such that it's going to take the path of least resistance to the ground. Right. Now, incidentally to that, there might be a possum right there on the ground in the middle of the path of least resistance, right? There's nothing about possums that make them always, or for the most part, the path of lightning to the ground. It just happens that this possum is in the wrong spot at the wrong time and it gets fried. Right? So we can recognize both the nature of the lightning bolt and its incidental concurrence of the possum spot.
Is it in the nature of possums to be run over?
That seems to happen always for the most part. Maybe it's in my nature to run over possums.
That's
maybe it's incidental to that.
I accidentally ran over a squirrel the other day. It felt bad. But, it's just like, you dummy, you're just going back and forth and just go across the road.
That's right.
Anyways, I mean, I think that it's not right. It's a result that happens, right, because we build so many roads, right, which is is an art, right? If there weren't so many roads, then possums wouldn't be run over, right? That kind of thing, right? So anyways, Jason, does that help sort of distinguish art and nature?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to apologize to all of our women listening. Please forgive us. Our analogies are the best that we can do. And so, yeah, I'll just throw that out there. But they're helpful. They're
That's
helpful.
right. That's right. That's right. Lightning bolts and possum. There you go. Okay. So I think that's helpful, right? So we want to think of nature as something intrinsic, right, to organisms, something that's prior to art, and as intrinsic to the organisms, and is the cause of or the root of their development, right? So I think this is especially interesting to think about in terms of human beings, but any really living organism. We think about human development or development of any organism. That's going to involve the development of certain parts, right? Aristotle is famous for it, and interesting, like he's unlike his, teacher Plato, right? Aristotle spends a good bit of time thinking about the parts of animals, things like teeth, right? And that's I think it shows like the attention he wants to see in the natural world. I'm just wrapping up an intro course, and one of the things I try to lay out there in the intro course is that Plato provides a really compelling and interesting account of order and meaning and purpose based on sort of a transcendent reality, right? A reality beyond change. Whereas Aristotle wants to say, no, actually, he does believe in an unmoved mover and intelligences and things like that, but he also thinks we can find order, right, within change, right, and a stable kind of order within change. Whereas his master Plato thought, it's just that stuff, who knows, right? I mean, it's all over the place, right? He says at one point the Republic is just kind of rolling around between being and non-being, right? The things of change and experience. Whereas Aristotle wants to say, no, if you observe change well enough, you're going to find an order that's intrinsic to it. And I think that order first, in the first case, is nature, right? And that's, I think, an interesting alternative to Plato, but also an interesting alternative, right, to some kind of modern views, which would kind of think that order or purpose or meaning is outside of nature. It's just something invented by, human beings, right? So that's, I think, why Aristotle's idea of nature is important in some ways, right? Is it's an alternative between there's no meaning, right? Or humans just make up meaning and purpose, or it's all transcendent and there's nothing in nature. No, there is something in nature. What do you think about sort of slicing it up that way, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. So Plato, we should credit him rightly with recognizing and trying to explain how there could be commonness in things. He just didn't think it could be in things, right? So Plato, we should credit with getting us to recognize universals, sort of ascending up from the particular to the universal. But Aristotle, we've got to credit with then bringing us back down from the universal to the particular, right? So that we can find the natures, the forms, or the universal in some way present in the particular here, right?
That's
so
right.
that we don't have things that are totally just imitations of universal things, but there's actually here present somehow in this dog, the nature of dog that is stable. Even amid the flux that the dog is sort of undergoing, right? There's something underlying all of those changes that remains there.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. That's. I mean, when you start thinking about that way, it's kind of a fascinating move, right? Because you're saying, the way I put it in the intro class is that beneath the changeable and the particular, we can find the permanent and the universal, right? Yeah. And I think that that's actually kind of in the pattern. Right, is like maybe a modern way or analogous way of speaking of it, right? It's in the pattern of change, and it's the human mind that can pull that pattern out, right, and say, "Oh, look, there's something stable and universal here." That despite all of the change that we find, right? And I think, really that's kind of, even today, I think that's kind of what the sciences aspire to, right? Whether you're thinking of kind of social sciences like economics and the laws of economics, you look at all the changes, right, that happen within economies, but then, economists try to pull out predictable relationships, structures, and processes, formulate laws, like the supply and demand, things like that will tell you something about prices, the change of prices. But then also say within ecosystems, right? You're trying to find a pattern that'll help you understand what's happening in that ecosystem.
Yeah, they keep genus and species in
That's
modern
right.
science, right? They don't get rid of that. They probably just understand it differently than Aristotle.
That's
But
right.
nonetheless, right, they're seeing somehow something
Mhm.
common between different members of a quote unquote family of animals or something.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, that's good. So Aristotle then moves, from this is all conversations inspired mostly by book 2 of the Physics. From moves from sort of defining nature to looking at the claim that nature acts for an end, right? And that's the thing that's really sort of interesting and surprising from a modern perspective, right? But also from an ancient perspective, because Aristotle sees himself in disagreement with the most ancient philosophers, right? Who tended to be the pre-Socratics, who tended to be more materialist or something like materialism. They tended to describe nature in terms of chance and necessity. Aristotle wants to deny both of nature, strictly speaking, and say that nature acts for an end, right? So he sees 3 possibilities here. Nature acts by necessity, nature acts by chance, and nature acts for an end, right? We might throw in another alternative here, which might be the modern alternative, which is that nature is some sort of combination of chance and necessity, right? And maybe that's also kind of what maybe some of the pre-Socratics thought as well. So I think it's best, the way Aristotle sets up this argument is he argues first that nature isn't by chance, right? And then second, that nature doesn't act according to necessity. So we'll start with the chance part here, and I'll read just a little bit from Physics, book 2, chapter 8, because it's a very interesting passage, and we'll put this text I'm reading from in the notes. It's a little bit longish, but I think it's helpful. Okay, so a difficulty presents itself. Why should not nature, not for the sake of something, nor because it is better so, but just as the sky rains, not in order to make the corn grow, but of necessity? What is drawn up must cool, and what has been cooled must become water and descend, the result of this being that corn grows. Similarly, if a man's crop is spoiled on the threshing floor, the rain did not fall for the sake of this, in order that the crop might be spoiled, but that result just followed. Why then should it not be the same with parts in nature? So here we're talking about the parts of animals, right? For example, that our teeth should come up of necessity. The front teeth sharp, fitted for tearing, the molars broad and useful for grinding down food, since they did not arise for this end, but as it were, merely a coincidental result. So here then we've got a combination, right? The teeth came up by necessity, and then by coincidence, that is by chance, right? They happen to be good for cutting, right? Okay, so there's a combination of necessity and chance. And so with all the other parts, which we suppose there is a purpose. Wherever then all of the parts came about just what they would have been if they had come to be for an end. Such things survived. That's so cool, right? Because that sounds very contemporary, right? Being organized spontaneously in a fitting way. Whereas those which grew up otherwise perished and continue to perish, as Empedocles says his man-faced ox progeny did. That's an unusual reference there, but anyways, so this is a really interesting. There's one other line. Skip down a couple. He says, "For teeth and all natural things, either." Oh, sorry. Well, that's Aristotle's answer, but that's a really interesting hypothesis. This is not what Aristotle thinks, right? But he's laying this out here in opposition to what he thinks. Joe, what do you think about this theory that's being described here?
Well, there's a lot that's loaded in here, and so
Absolutely.
if we're not really familiar with this passage, we might want to maybe define a few terms. But probably the most interesting thing, right, is as you pointed out, this is a rather contemporary view. It's actually extraordinarily similar to Darwinian evolutionary theory, right, by natural selection.
Yeah.
That certain changes just happen one way or another. It's haphazard. And as it happens, by chance or really by spontaneity. It happens in a fitting way, and so that those things survive, whereas this man-faced ox progeny did not, right? So
Right.
Empedocles thought something like there was all of these random things coming into being generated and be generated in different ways, and some of those things sort of worked out and some of them didn't.
Right.
And that's not altogether different than Darwin. It's just that Empedocles sort of puts together really complex parts, whereas Darwin thinks that the complex parts would only sort of come out of the simpler
Sure.
parts, the simpler sort of
Sure.
substances.
Yeah.
What about though chance and spontaneity, necessity? I think we should define those terms.
Yeah, that's good. So chance, I think one of Aristotle's famous passages of this is chance has to do with like the farmer finding buried treasure in the field. Right. So, your farmer is out there to plow the earth, right, in order to get ready to, to sow the seed and get the crops going. Another man, a thief, has stolen treasure and buried it in the field, right, so that he can come back later and get it when his neighbors aren't suspecting him, right? These two lines, so you think about it as like kind of lines, right, of action, right? The farmer is intending to grow crops, and so he's moving, right, carrying on a series of actions that will bring about the growth of crops. The thief is carrying out a series of actions that will bring about his possession and use of stolen goods, right? These things have nothing intrinsic or essential. They have no intrinsic or essential relationship to each other, right? But it just so happens, right, that the farmer, as he's plowing the field, finds the gold, right, and then takes the gold for himself. That didn't happen by nature, didn't happen by necessity. It happened by chance. I think that's a good illustration, right?
What I think you mean, right, by there being no essential connection is that there's nothing included in the definition of burying treasure that a farmer is going to find it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas, like, if something is killed, it dies. Right. There's some sort of essential connection there.
Right.
So that's what we're talking about when we say that there's no essential connection. We're looking at the definition of the things happening.
Sure.
And what's connected with those things in virtue of what they are.
That's right. It's good to explain that. So I mean, and taking the side of the farmer on this. I mean, we're at the case that finding buried treasure was essential to being a farmer. We'd all be farmers, right? But sadly, it's not so.
And that's interesting because everyone recognizes that. What's essentially connected with being a farmer, and it's not digging up buried treasure. That's right. Yeah, this just crops, right, which may be worth something or maybe not.
That's right. Yeah, Jason, what do you think about that? Does that make sense? That the distinction?
It's very helpful in the just the idea that it by chance we mean that it could be otherwise, right? There could be some other something else. It could happen a different way, right? So he could have buried it somewhere else. The farmer could not have discovered it, right?
He might have decided to stay in that morning. Right?
No, y'all explained it very well.
All right, good. So I think in this setting, right, so you're talking about the development of teeth. Another one that's always challenging to the Darwinian view is the development of the eye. Even Darwin conceded that in his own writings, that the eye was so complex, that it seemed difficult to account for. But the claim here then is if you're going to follow Empedocles, the teeth come up by necessity. Coincidentally, they're useful for eating, right? And so it's by chance that there's a relationship between teeth. This is so interesting. It's by chance that there's a relationship between teeth and eating, right? It's fortunate, right, that our teeth are such that they're just right.
Oh yeah,
for being omnivores.
Right? We won the biological lottery, right?
Yeah, just prima facie. When I hear that kind of thing, it just doesn't seem.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jason?
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I'm like, all right. Well, I mean, so you're by necessity. Not only did your teeth grow, they grew the right size, they grew in the right place, right? They're not on your feet, they're not on your hand, right? They happen to be here. Like, I mean, and then you, oh yeah, by chance.
Yeah.
Come on, you know, but and especially I think what's odd about that argument is that you do believe in necessity, but only to a certain point. Right? So you're going to say the teeth came up by necessity, but everything else is by chance. Well, you know, why?
Yeah, it's by chance that they're useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Why does he stop the necessary line kind of right there? I think, you know, I think it would make more sense just to keep going with the necessity argument. But again, yeah.
I mean, the thing I think you have to say about it is, I guess it's possible, right? Or I mean, unless maybe you can find some philosophical principles. I think Aristotle maybe introduces some that would say, actually, this is not possible. But at least you could say on the front end, you know, by hypothesis or for the sake of argument, you know, it's a possible explanation. It just doesn't seem like a very good one. I guess given enough time, you know, the teeth could come up by necessity, and they just happen to be apt for eating. And I guess those that didn't have all of the factors that converge to make teeth necessary, right, or come about necessarily, they're I guess they're a bunch of humans who just have gums, and they I guess become weak and flabby and die off, right, because they can't eat meat or more substantial things. What do you think? Is that right? Something like that.
Yeah, this is tough because I would want to say that they would push chance back further, right? So it is by chance that the teeth came about, and then so there's random mutations that are going to result, so quote unquote random, right? Which are not really in a way by chance.
Yeah.
There's we assign chance as a cause, right? When we can't really figure out exactly what's going on, or when it's so complicated that we can't do it. Like if you take a deck of cards and you shuffle them, right? There's what we might say a 1 in 52 chance that the ace of spades is on the top, right? Or wherever it might be. But presumably if you knew all of the relevant, you know, quantitative information about the deck of cards and the friction involved and the amount of force applied and their original position, you could presumably know that there is where the ace of spades is going to be after the deck is shuffled.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
So I think that's the way they use the terminology like chance when they're talking about the development of teeth or something. Some mutation, right? That they're behind it all. There's some sort of physicochemical process that's going to might happen to result in some beneficial adaptation rather than a mere mutation.
Yeah, sure.
Then,
I guess because what you want to push back on is to say, okay, well, why did some of the species have factors that necessarily produce teeth and other in the same species not necessarily produce teeth, right? If it is from necessity, right, and that we would presume maybe you have the same gum structure, right, you have the same skeletal structure in the face, that sort of thing, why some and not all, right? If it's by necessity, right? Well, it would seem that, you know, that maybe there's some underlying factor, but, you know, you end up kind of kicking the can down the road, right? Again, right? So, you know, of course, you know, I mean, not to bring in too much Thomas here, but you don't want to have an infinite regress of, you know, you need some sort of per se order eventually, right? And chance and necessity don't seem to account for it. So, but this is Aristotle's response to this, okay, is, and this goes to what you were saying earlier, Joe, that what happens always, or for the most part, is not by chance, right? That is, it's not coincidental, right? So I'll just read here this other paragraph and then we'll maybe talk about it. So this is the next paragraph down. He says, yet it is impossible that this should be the true view. For teeth, and all other natural things either invariably or normally come about in a given way. But of not one of the results of chance or spontaneity is this true. So that's the key premise, I think, in Aristotle's argument. What's by chance is not invariable or normal or ordinary. We do not ascribe to chance or mere coincidence the frequency of rain in winter, but frequent rain in summer we do, nor heat in the dog days, but only if we have it in winter. If then it is agreed that things are either the result of coincidence or for an end, really interesting. I think that's a disjunctive there, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's either by coincidence or for the sake of an end, right? If then, right, so, and these cannot be the result of coincidence or spontaneity, it follows that they must be for an end, and that such things are all due to nature. Even the champions of theory, which we have as first, would agree. So the way Aristotle is conceptualizing this argument, it seems to me, is we've got a disjunctive, right? Either it's by chance or by nature, or it's either by chance or for the sake of an end, right? It cannot be natural motion, cannot be by chance because of the premise that nature does what's always or for the most part, and coincidental things are not always or for the most part. Therefore, the other hypothesis follows, right? So it's kind of a P or Q, not P, therefore Q style argument. Is that about right?
Yeah, so this should be obvious, right? That what is the result of chance by definition cannot be always or for the most part, right? Or what?
Right, yeah.
So like if you roll the dice and you're getting 6 every single time, that dice is loaded, right? It's not by chance, right? So everyone knows that.
That's right. You would know that for sure. Yeah. As if you're in a competitive game. I've actually, this is silly, but there's we liked the boys and my family, we like to play strategy games, right? That involve rolling dice. And there's a dice that I have banned from the game, right? Because too often it came up with 5s and 6s. I was like, there's something wrong with this dice. It's banned. But anyways, but you're obviously right. You know, if you and I were playing a game, right? Or let's just say we were doing a simple bet on pulling out one card out of the 52 card deck, right? Mm-hmm. If you kept coming up over and over and over and over again with the ace of hearts, I'd be like, wait a second. This is not by chance.
That's right. Yeah.
There's something designated going on, right?
Yeah. Right. Now there could still be maybe underneath it, right? Maybe this doesn't. I don't think it doesn't totally refute Darwin. I think there's still room for Darwin to speak here, or for maybe Empedocles too. But you could say that initially something had happened by chance.
Okay.
Right. That happened to work out well, and because it worked out well, then it sort of becomes part of nature, right? There might be a way to bring both of these guys into some sort of agreement here. Like, we don't want to say that Darwin doesn't think that trees randomly grow in the same shape every single time, right?
Yeah, that's correct. You're right.
Yeah, but that somewhere prior to the development of their current structure, there was some sort of change which was in fact random and probably at the time not, if we can speak in Aristotelian terms, not intended by the nature of the thing that was changing, right? But it just happened to work out better for the environment in which that particular plant was growing.
Sure.
Such that it would continue to develop in this new structural way rather than in the old structural way.
Yeah, I think that is a possibility. I'll maybe when we get to the section on necessity, I'll share what I think. I'm not sure about what I think about it, to be honest, totally. But I see what you're saying. That's fair. Jason, did you want to add anything into there on that as far as the structure of the argument or the main premise there? That what happens always or for the most part is not by chance.
No, that's fairly clear.
Okay. Yeah. All right, good. So I think Aristotle sees it that way, right? As something that should be a clear sort of, it's obviously not by chance, right? Kind of thing, right? Now, he also, though, has the burden here to argue that it's not by necessity, right? So he's going to want to argue it's not by it's not by chance, it's not by necessity. Therefore, it's for the sake of an end, right? And again, he's talking about things that are natural motions, including the development of the parts of animals, right? So again, you're thinking about the development of an organism, right, over time. You think about the growth of a child, right, or even from sort of embryology, right, from the embryo up through right the mature adult male, right? You've got parts being developed, even after the all the organs and so forth. There's still the brain. We know now, I mean, Aristotle wouldn't have known all the details of it, but we know now, right, even the brain kind of continues developing after the birth of the child, right? So there what we're asking then is, okay, is that by chance? No, it's not by chance, right? Now we're going to look at what Aristotle has to say about it being by necessity, right? Because he's going to want to deny that it's by necessity. Then we have then we have to kind of think a little bit about, well, what does it mean by saying for the sake of an end, right? Because I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. So his argument against the necessity is in chapter 9. And I won't read that section because it's actually fairly short, like what he has to say about it. He thinks that it's not that natural things don't act by necessity except conditionally, right? And that there's a conditional kind of necessity there, but that conditional necessity is the material cause, is identified with the material cause, and that the material cause is not sufficient to account for the development of the organism or natural motion, right? So again, he thinks that there's a kind of conditional necessity, and that conditional necessity is identified with the material cause, but that the material cause is not a sufficient explanation to account for natural motion. So I'll give us maybe an artificial example of I think what he's got going on here, and then maybe we can kind of push out from that to a natural example. So an artificial example here, and you think about conditional necessity. Let's say that I buy some lumber in order to make furniture, right? So I want to make a wooden table, right? Having the wood, right? Like the first step, right, in my project here is, of course, to go and buy the lumber, right? To get the materials necessary for the job, right? Necessary for the job. Now, having lumber, let's say I buy the lumber and I put it in the shed in my backyard, right? Having lumber in the shed is actually not necessary as such, right? It's not absolutely necessary, right? Because there was a time when the lumber wasn't in the shed, right? And there's plenty of sheds out there that don't have lumber in them, right? So in that sense, right, the having the lumber in the shed is not necessary. It's conditionally necessary that I have lumber if I want to build, right? You got the if part there, right? It presupposes my intention to build a table, that there is wood in the shed, right? Going further, when I begin to assemble that lumber, like I wish it were the case, right, that I could just buy the lumber, set it in the shed, and then come out the next day and there'd be a table, right? That would be awesome, right? That'd be the best, right? But unfortunately, there is not self-generating tables out of lumber yet, right? So rather, the lumber needs to be arranged given a certain arrangement, right? That is given a form by an agent, right? So here we got the causes starting to unfold, right? We've got a material cause, we've got an agent, myself, purchasing the lumber and then arranging the lumber into a table, but I'm not acting at random, right? I'm acting for an end, right? So is there a necessity to the lumber? Yes. It's a conditional necessity conditioned on my intention to build, right? And that lumber doesn't by necessity become a table. It becomes a table with the presupposition, right, of my intention to have a table, right? So in that sense, right, the table does not arise of necessity, right? Rather, there's a necessity that's conditioned upon the intention. What do you think about that, Jason? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the thing that keeps popping in my head with this kind of just reasoning and stuff is when thinking about stem cells. This is why I think in science, this is why stem cells are so interesting, because when they're left alone in the body, they develop in such a way that there seems to be intention, but we don't know where it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
And so because they can, because again, the majority of the time, so go back to Joe's definition, right? The majority of the time, certain cells develop into a nose, and certain cells develop into a mouth. It doesn't, it's not like, oh, I wonder if our baby's going to have 4 noses this time.
That's terrible, Jason.
Somebody apologize to the women out there.
We'll work on it. We'll work on it.
We're learning.
For Christmas, we'll get new analogies. I promise. But I mean, like, I think that's why, in science, the study of stem cells is so interesting, because we recognize that this, to use your example, right, it would be like us recognizing that, okay, there's this lumber there, and it becomes a bookcase. So there must have been some sort of something guiding it, whether in the case of the stem cells, there's some kind of internal principle that again, under the right conditions,
that's right,
that develop into this and develop into that. And there seems to be some intention there. So that's where my mind is going.
That's good, Jason. I mean, I think what you see in the background is a kind of intentional energy, right? Or actuality, right? It's like there needs to be something kind of directing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the key is that the stem cell in itself is indeterminate, right? That's the key. It's indeterminate, and it's awaiting determination. There would need to be some cause to give it that determination. If it already had the nature of nose cells or the nature of brain cells or whatever, then there would be nothing. It would have to become nose cell or brain cell.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's good. And so this is where I think the matter as potency, right, as the principle of potential, right, it's not a sufficient explanation for the formation of teeth, right? The fact that whatever exactly teeth develop out of in the human jaw, right, that material just on its own isn't sufficient account. What the matter, and it doesn't give you a sufficient account of action always, and for the most part, right, which is our kind of criteria for what's natural, right? So instead, right, so we have chance. Nature doesn't act by chance. Nature doesn't act by necessity, right? The necessity there presupposes a kind of arrangement, right? A kind of form, a kind of intentionality, right? For the matter to come to be, right? This thing on a regular basis, that is teeth in our example. So instead, nature acts for an end. Nature brings about teeth because it's good, right? And it's good for this organism, right? I think, sometimes I've tried to avoid saying it because it's good, right? Because you want to kind of keep your metaphysics as thin as possible, especially when you're trying to defend all this stuff, right, in a contemporary context. But the truth is, that's what Aristotle thinks. That's Aristotle's view, right? Is that that we have the feet we have because it's good for us, right? It's good for the organism to be Homo erectus, right? That is to be to stand upright, right? And our hands are structured the way they are because it's desirable for us to have these kinds of hands, and it's desirable for us to have teeth that we have because it's desirable to have an omnivore diet, right? That sort of thing. Is that correct, Joe? as far as you
Yeah,
can
I
tell?
think so. I mean, I do think this is a really complicated question, and I think that I think the stem cell matter thing is really, really good. I still think that there could be we're going to get pushback. This is where I'm just trying to make sure that everyone knows we haven't totally resolved, I think, the question.
Mhm.
We're going to get pushback where somebody will say something like, well, the reason the stem cell matter becomes teeth and that happens to work out is because, well, there's some sort of determination that is in the DNA
Sure.
that gives that sort of direction to the stem cell matter,
Mhm.
and then it just happens to work out
Mhm.
well, right?
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
I agree. But if you're going with DNA, right, you're just kicking the can down the road as far as I'm concerned, right? Because you're still going to end up with, well, why do these proteins, right,
That's
and
right. Yeah.
components, produce this outcome here and this outcome there? Well,
Yeah.
it has to do with their arrangement, right? And that arrangement, either comes from chance, necessity, or intention, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me Aristotle's laying this out as like, here are your options, right? For now, he doesn't, as we'll say, he does think there's a conditional necessity, right? Here. So he's not sort of dismissing necessity altogether, right? He's not dismissing the matter altogether, right? The matter is necessary. It's the, you could say, maybe using modern terminology, it's the necessary condition, right?
Mhm.
It's not the sufficient condition for that development. And I mean, kind of maybe also in Aristotle, in the background here, Aristotle still has some Plato back there, right, in terms of thinking that it's for the good, right?
Mhm.
But maybe we can get to that in a few minutes. What do you think, Joe, about how should we understand nature acting for an end? Certainly he doesn't mean that trees have purposes like carpenters, right? In the sense of, I could do this, I could do, and then a volitional intention and things like that, right? He's not
they're
saying,
determined to one, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's not saying that. So in what, now we metaphorically, maybe we could kind of, talk about that. But how should we describe the tree acting for an end that's distinct from a carpenter acting for an end?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the first thing we say is that there is no options, right? That there is a certain determination written into what the tree is that determines it to one certain direction, one certain act, which is its proper function or perfection, right? So I think principal difference there is that the tree does not set its own end, whereas the artist does, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's still a certain similarity in that the artist can fail in his work, and the tree can also fail,
Yes.
right? So we're not talking about a strict necessity in the sense that it cannot but happen.
That's right.
We are talking about something where the tendency, or if you speak a little loosely and you say the intention of nature is always going to be the production of the new tree and the perpetuation of the species, which is very Darwinian, right? There's a lot of agreement there.
Perpetuation of species, sure.
Yeah, so that's the intention of the tree, and then sometimes the tree falls short of achieving that action, either because it has some defect in the matter, whether because there's some intervening coincidental cause, like a bolt of lightning that interrupts the process, right? There could be potentially infinite number of intervening causes that could prevent it.
Right. So, but it would still be in a situation where we're recognizing that even with things that are non-cognitive, right, that they can act for an end. In that sense, you're talking about they have an intrinsic trajectory towards a certain kind of developmental pattern, towards a certain perfection, a certain kind of actualization. But what's, I think, really key, to me, if this is pushing it too far, the parts, it's not that, because it's easy to get this messed up, right? Well, given the parts, then this results always, right? I don't think that's right for Aristotle. It's given this purpose or this end, this good, this desirable outcome, right, than the parts, right? That is, like, the eye doesn't just happen to have a structure that befits seeing. Rather, the desirable end of seeing is the cause of the arrangement of the eye.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
So the
correct.
generation of an eye, right, is because it is good for the sensitive animal to be able to see, right? Or the generation of a certain color of fruit on a tree is good because it attracts certain animals to the tree to eat the fruit, spread the seeds or something,
That's
right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's the order of priority, I think, for Aristotle.
And I think for that, I think that in a lot of ways that's prior to Darwin, whether Darwin fully intended this or not, but I kind of think he did, because he says he does want to get rid of teleology, right? This is actually, I think, kind of the common sense way, like prior to Darwin, to think like, about, well, like whenever you think about an ecosystem or a complex relationship between different organisms or things like that, that there's some sense in which it's good, right, for this, natural relationship to happen. In which case, right, this I think is really interesting in a number of ways. Desirability is built into nature, right? There's good, like goodness, right, is not a projection onto nature, right, but rather goodness is part of the natural order of things, right? We can find goodness there, we can discover goodness, but it's part of both the explanation of natural occurrences, right, as well as the foundation of ethics.
Yeah. I mean, I think that sounds right and complete to me. I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. Well, I think I do want to make a qualification and say, I don't mean necessarily moral goodness, right? I mean, we can talk about natural goodness without moral goodness. Moral goodness is a subset of goodness, right? Moral goodness has to do with voluntariness, right? So we voluntarily strive for what's really desirable, but that there are things that really are desirable is already sort of packed into nature itself, right? So I guess, what I think where all this matters then is that when you think about, this is a point that a strange philosopher, not a Thomist at all, but Alvin Plantinga brings up in his considerations about evolution. And that is, how do you know that the human mind is set up such that if it's randomly generated, right? How do you know that the human mind is set up such that it finds the truth, right? Maybe it's just a weird mechanism that just, systematically creates illusion or something, right? Like rather science already presupposes, right, the fecundity and reliability of our cognitive mechanism, right? That it's capable of discovering the truth. Well, that makes a lot more sense, right, in a world where we think things are organized for what's desirable for them, right? That the mind would be such that, it finds truth, right? And that's because truth is desirable for the mind, right? Or for something that is cognitive.
Yeah, I wonder if also it'd be helpful to add that, building on what you said before, that the sort of default way of approaching nature, right, is that it does act in this ordered way so as to always and for the most part achieve this best result. And it really takes a bit of highfalutin philosophical reasoning to get to see it as, actually, no, it's ultimately this product of chance, like the way Empedocles thought. And I think that's the way Aristotle and Aquinas approached this, right? That the priority here is that really it's evident that nature acts for an end. It's inductively evident because we see the order every time we look outside, and we abide by the order every single time we do something.
That's right.
And we know what's going to happen. Even I set the coffee mug down, I know it's not going to float up into the air, right?
That's right.
So that sort of regularity, I think, is there. It's evident from induction, and everyone sort of knows it. So really, if we're going to be dealing with problems like evolution, it seems to me the task is not to try to resolve Aristotle into that, as if somehow Darwin has the place of priority here.
Right.
In the scientific procedure, right? We always start with what is more known and then try to work out what is more obscure. And in this case, I think it is obvious that if chance is involved in the production of natures, then that is certainly not as clear as the order that's
right.
evidently found in all things of the natural world. So we would start from this place of recognizing that it is evident that nature acts in an ordered way, so as to always, for the most part, achieve the best result. And if it also happens to be the case that there are genetic mutations that can happen to different animals, different natures, to give them new attributes or even perhaps new capacity, well, there's got to be a way that is resolvable back to what is more evident, namely that nature acts in an ordered way. So
that's right.
Always,
that's very, that's great, Joe. I totally agree with that. So yeah, I mean, I think I know we need to probably wrap it up here, but I think that's all helpful in terms of thinking about, evolutionary theory, thinking about just from a contemplative perspective when we contemplate nature, right? I think it's exciting and enriching, right, to think about the contemplation of nature in terms of you're contemplating an order of desirability and goodness there, right? It's not just this thing that happens to, cause me to have certain feelings about it, but rather I have feelings of appreciation and estimations about nature because that's in nature, right? That is, that there's a kind of desirability there. I think that's another important result, and it's the foundation of ethics, right? As well. One last thing, and I don't want to maybe, I just want to offer as a suggestion before we wrap up, Jason, but this opens up, then once you sort of accept this view, it does open up an avenue into natural theology, right? And we know that from, say, Thomas's developments of this in the fifth way. I also think that there might be, I'm not prepared to argue this right now, but Joe, have you read much Lloyd Gerson?
No,
He's a scholar of Aristotle. He wrote that controversial book, Aristotle and Other Platonists.
Oh, okay. I've heard of him. Yes.
Yeah. So he has some interesting things to say about the unmoved mover and the relationship between the unmoved mover and final causality that I think maybe are underappreciated sometimes in Aristotelian scholarship. There's also sort of an argument Ed Feser, right, uses, right? He tends to be kind of down on Paley's arguments, right? He thinks that what Paley is doing and what Aristotle is doing are really radically different, right? In terms of, or what Aquinas is doing, sorry, in the fifth way, are really radically different. And he might be right in a lot of ways. But one thing that strikes me about final causality is that maybe it's the case that for Aristotle, final causality does ultimately depend on divine nous, right? That is some sort of thinking and intentional thing, right? Certainly the way I read the fifth way, which is a little bit maybe different than Feser. I never can quite get exactly what he's trying to dispute there, but the way I read the fifth way is that although nature acts for an end, unintelligent things are not a sufficient cause for acting for an end, right? That is, unintelligent things are not it's fine as an explanation to say that the eye sees because, right, it's natural. That's a good explanation. We can give lots of explanations about how that, the process or whatever, but that unintelligent matter doesn't self-organize into intentionality, but rather that presupposes mind at some level, right? And so that mind is really you can talk about levels maybe of final causality, but ultimately sort of that sense of intentional cognitive final causality seems to be sort of the ultimate account. Like I said, I don't have all the steps for the argument, but just as a kind of a project, what do you think about that, Joe?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it has to. I think this is the way the fifth way goes, right? I think your reading of it is basically right. He starts with the premise that it is evident that there are things acting for ends in nature, right? It is also equally evident that things in nature do not have the capacity to do this on their own, right? So like the other many of his other arguments for the existence of God, if you identify some capacity that something has that doesn't have simply automatically and in virtue of itself, that has to be derived from something else that does have that sort of capacity. So if you have a thing which is directed not by chance, but in an ordered way, always for the most part, so as to achieve the best result.
That's right.
That means there's some sort of noose out there directing it, right? And I think that much it's clear. Like if we found on Mars concentric circles of rocks, right? We found order.
That would be such a fun argument to have, right? Like when we say, "Oh no, it's just by chance in nature."
But it'd be obvious, right? It'd be so obvious that there's some sort of mind behind that sort of organization, because the rock obviously cannot do that simply automatically in virtue of what it is, right? It just wouldn't happen.
It seems to me then that and maybe we can do this for another podcast, but there's a per se order of causes then, right? In which nature acting for an end presupposes cognitive action for an end, for lack of a better way of putting it. But Jason, what do you think about that? You want to wrap us up here?
Yeah, I love all of it. I'll just say that. No, it's good. It's good in helping. I think for the Christian, I'll bring it back to that. For the Christian, right, and trying to really bring together, the God of reason and the God of faith. I think this is very helpful, and to see that we can have rational, I don't want to say non-theological, but almost pre-theological arguments.
That's fine.
Kind of pre-theological arguments for why we believe what we believe, particularly, and I mean, I think this sets up perfectly when we go into especially things like sexual ethics and things like that. This does a fantastic job of setting up what we believe, that it just doesn't come out of a old bunch of celibate men in Rome telling us what to do, but it comes out of good philosophy, clear thinking, and some good solid principles that need to be thought through and well argued. And so thank you, Joe, for joining us today.
Joe, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was good fun.
Yeah, you've added a lot to our conversation. I think we've given our audience a lot to think about. And so I want to invite all of our listeners, check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.